I'm Scott L. Miller. This is my life living in Nicaragua. I talk to people who are looking at moving abroad all the time, and a lot of times people have questions about things like when are you an expat, when are you an immigrant? And similarly, there are big questions around when do you become a resident and how does this affect you? And there's a lot of confusion around the concept of residency. And I had a question about this where someone was wondering, probably, I believe, to the Canadian government, they said, how does this affect you when you obtain residency in another country? And the question actually demonstrates that there's a misunderstanding of what residency is. And I think that with a good explanation, we can make this a lot easier for everyone. So today we're going to dig into exactly what it means to become a resident, temporary or permanent, of a new country, because understanding that terminology and how that differs from citizenship will be really important. So we're going to get to that, and we're going to move into some shade right after the bump. Finding any kind of consistency to the sun here is a challenge, especially as I record all throughout the day. Being a citizen in a country is a very discrete thing and is recognized by the United Nations and by all countries in the world as being a very discrete thing. And you can list yourself and have identity, and it's a standard thing. You actually belong to a country. So because we deal with this all the time, and because we are automatically both citizens and residents of the countries that we grow up in, at least most of the time. Some Americans do face a problem where they are not actually citizens of the country that they grow up in. We generally don't really think about these terms and have to deal with them very much. But when we move abroad, we start having to deal with them quite a bit. And a lot of people assume that simply by moving to a new country that you are a resident there. And while there is some terminology where you may actually use that when speaking to your friends or family, for example, being a formal resident is a different thing in most cases. Not every country recognizes the same thing as residency. So now citizenship, being a very formal process, is quite different. When you become the citizen of a country, you are actually owned by that country. They actually have some claim to you. And you have this concept of potentially revoking that citizenship, carrying dual citizenships, and so forth. It does not imply that you live in that country. In some cases, it may not even imply that you've ever visited that country. And this can apply anywhere, right? There are many people who grew up in the United States and have no knowledge of any other country, yet are not Americans. There are Americans who have grown up around the world and have no idea that they have a connection to the United States and find out that they are claimed as Americans. This is actually relatively complex. Now, the majority of people anywhere in the world are citizens of the place where they were born and never consider being citizens anywhere else, and no country is ever, muddying the waters. It's very straightforward for the majority of people. But there are certainly people who get caught having no idea that they are not a citizen of the country that they grew up in, and may not know what citizenships they carry. It is actually relatively common to find out that you have citizenship somewhere that you had no idea about, especially if you grew up in the New World and may have ties to the Old World. In the Old World, it is less likely that you have some colonial ties that may do that. But even there, it still happens. And you never know, because it can be a parent who somehow ended up with a tie to somewhere, and it's not direct to you, but it carries through, and it can be relatively complicated. When you are a citizen of a country, you can apply for a passport from that country, and you are under a tax regime. And if you are from some places like the United States, you can be taxed on worldwide income, even if you've never been to the United States and have no knowledge of being American and don't speak English or have access to anything. But technically, you have the right of return and the ability to work in the U.S. You just may not know about it, which makes the concept of what a right is a little bit of a gray area, but that's a separate conversation. And those are very rare cases. It's just examples of how it can get complicated. But citizenship is a formal process. It's extremely formal, and there are very tight rules about it because it applies to international relations and how a person is identified between countries, and you cannot legally be without a citizenship. So countries cannot take away your final citizenship unless you have multiple citizenships, and then there's the potential to lose one of the others that you have, and so forth. Like, it really does become pretty complicated. Now, because of this, everybody is a citizen and of somewhere, right? I understand it's possible to be stateless, but that is an extreme case, and not anyone watching this video, that is for sure. So you all are familiar with citizenship from the time that you were born. We all grow up being aware of it. Residency doesn't start coming in until we do things later in life, and so it doesn't bring this intrinsic knowledge in the same way, so we have to talk about it. Now, we use the term resident all the time, but in different contexts. Here in Nicaragua, I say things like I reside in Sutiaba or in Leon, and people understand that that's just where my main house is. When I grew up in New York, we would say we were a resident of New York. Now, within the United States, state residency is a formal thing, much like citizenship. So within the United States, we have this formal internal thing for residency for nearly all of the US citizens. This leads us to feeling like residency is more formal in the rest of the world than it really is. That is state residency in the United States. It's not general residency, but you may still have complicated scenarios. I mentioned this one recently on the show. I was a New York resident for most of my life, but for quite a few years, I lived in New Jersey. So if I'm talking to the state of New York and they said, "Where are you a resident?" I would say in New York, because legally I'm a New York resident. But if the question is, of what state am I a resident? It was, well, New Jersey is where I reside. And so the English question, where am I a resident, was different than the legal question, where am I a resident? And none of that was because I was manipulating the system. That was because New Jersey had requirements to become a resident that I did not meet, even though I lived and worked in New Jersey, which is bizarre. But that was their rules, and New York didn't have rules that kicked me out. So the combination meant because I was claimable by New York in the past, and I was not currently claimable by New Jersey, I remained a New York resident on paper, but a New Jersey resident in practice. The U.S. gets complicated with its states from time to time. So that process highlights how confusing it can be, even with residency, but that is unique to the United States, where your state residence is considered an important part of your identity. In most of the world, we don't have things like that. So when you're going to move to a new country, you have a number of ways that you can stay there. One is by being a citizen, of course. And in nearly all countries, the act of being a citizen gives you the ability to reside there indefinitely. There can be exceptions to that, but I don't know of any. But in theory, there could be exceptions. Most people assume that when moving to a new country, they're going to have some form of residence because they will be residing there. And just like in the United States with the states, that's not entirely true. For example, if you go on vacation somewhere, you generally don't say that you're residing there, but how do you differentiate between being on vacation for a short period of time and a long period of time and being a semi-permanent resident? Of course, the idea of being on vacation is that you will return, but many people who are residents of a place for a long time do plan on returning or at least moving on somewhere. So we have this very difficult concept of understanding when does it become residency versus just traveling through a place. And there is no strict answer, which helps highlight that the concept of residency is not a solid thing. It is not a exact science. So let's use Nicaragua as an example. If you come here and reside here, meaning we're not going to talk about people who are on vacation, that's pretty much silly to discuss. Let's talk about people who are intentionally going to stay a very long time. They're going to rent an apartment. They're going to do grocery shopping. They're going to send their mail here and have packages and make a life and invest in their home or their furnishings or whatever. They're going to act as people who live there. So here in Nicaragua, it is generally accepted that you will come and put in a lot of time on what is known as a tourist visa, which is a visitor's visa, the same one you use to come for the weekend or to go see the volcanoes or to, go to the lake or whatever, go surfing. And so you come down and that's what you stay on. There's no formal process to this. Of course, there's a formal process of coming over the border, but there's no formal visa. There's no paper that goes in your passport. There's nothing you have to apply for most of my audience anyway. If you're coming from North America or Europe, most of Latin America, it is just welcome to Nicaragua, right? That is the entire process, and that can go on for a long time. At some point, you may decide, well, I want something more formal. Maybe I want certain benefits, or I want to register, or maybe the government says you can only stay a prolonged period of time if you do some additional paperwork. You say, no problem. Then you look at concepts such as temporary or permanent residency. Now, here in Nicaragua, we don't really refer to them in that way. We pretty much refer to everything as permanent residency. Now, there are different levels. Some require more often renewals. Some are 1 year, some are 5 year. And then, of course, in theory, you could achieve citizenship, which is permanent, but but that we're just talking about residency right now. And most people coming to Nicaragua never look at citizenship. They're just looking at residency options, if anything, right? Because they can come and visit for a very long time without going through a formal residency process. Many people opt for that. So a short-term residency, the 1 year, such as the rentista and the pensiado, are available to you and require relatively little proof of income and requirements and so forth. And then they're relatively easy. So a lot of people look at those. And we also have a very common, right, and do a lot of investment in the country. And you can get a 5-year residency from that process, right? Invest in the country and get a 5-year residency. And so we understand these things to be these formal residency processes. And with those, you can stay. And at the end of them, you can renew them and so forth. Now, looking at Paraguay as another example of a country who has similar end results, but does so in a few different ways, they have a different mechanism. They don't have the same really long-term tourist visa thing. They basically give you a shorter term on a tourist visa. Of course, you can visit Paraguay for a vacation. That's no problem. So getting in on that initial visa is not a challenge. But they expect you to get a temporary, it's officially called a temporary resident paperwork of temporary residency relatively quickly. Unlike Nicaragua, who's like, no, push that way off. Paraguay's like, let's do this really quickly. But unlike Nicaragua, that has, for example, a $1,000 a month minimum pension income for the pensionado, the lowest of the requirements. Paraguay does not have any income requirement at all. And generally, when you're looking at the entry level permanent residency in Nicaragua is a little bit harder to get than the temporary residency in Paraguay. So we may think of Paraguay as being a little bit easier, but we'll get to that. But then Paraguay only gives you probably about one renewal for a total, I think, of 4 years on multiple temporaries, and then they require you move to a permanent, which is slightly harder to get, but still quite easy. Plus, they do have investment and stuff that's much harder than Nicaragua's, but people who are looking at minimums are generally not too concerned with that, and you do have other paths to residency, so it's generally not something you have to worry about. It does give you this really long-term stuff in Paraguay that is very nice. There are reasons that people do it, but it's not generally a big deal. So in both countries, you can end up at a permanent residency without too much work. The difference is that in Nicaragua, they generally push off any residency whatsoever, and then once you move into the residency program, you're in a permanent residency program. And in Paraguay, they do it quite quickly, but they have a in-between temporary residency program that then goes to a permanent one. Every country has their own processes and options for doing this, and these are interesting because they're so similar in so many ways, but their end results are essentially identical, but the process by which they do it is wildly different. So in one case, you're living permanently in Nicaragua, and one, you're permanently in Paraguay. But 2 years into your process, if someone was to say, are you officially a resident in Paraguay, you certainly would be, but in Nicaragua, likely you would not be. But does that change your status to the outside world, and why does it work that way? And what does that then imply? So when other countries want to know where you are a resident of, they want to know where you live. They don't want to know about formal residency, because that formal residency is meaningless outside of the countries. And this should demonstrate it, right? The same person in Nicaragua to Nicaragua is not called a resident, but in Paraguay is called a resident. Yet no one has higher requirements. They're same amount of time, same behavior. It's just the name of the paperwork under which they do different things. So if you're the United States government, the Canadian government, whatever, and people are wondering, well, how will the U.S. or Canada behave when I become a resident somewhere else? So first of all, your residency status in Nicaragua or Paraguay or anywhere else is no one else's business. That is not something that is disclosed to other countries, unlike your citizenship, which is a public record. So nobody knows if you're a resident somewhere else, and nor do they care. It is a meaningless status. And now, technically, in the countries that we listed, that status gives you certain things, like you're allowed to stay and have multiple entries and different things, but you don't necessarily have complete freedom of movement. You don't have some permanent status that can't be revoked. It's very ephemeral. It comes and goes depending on different things, and nothing is truly permanent, and it's not like a citizenship. So in general, the US and Canada have no reason to care about that because they care where you live, and they may not even care where so much as is it inside their country or outside their country. The US has no concern about where you live around the world. All of their laws are written around, are you inside the United States or are you outside the United States? And then make decisions based on that. How long are you outside the United States? Do you plan to return? Are you outside because you're on a diplomatic mission, or is it a personal or business thing? Whatever. Fairly basic and straightforward. But they do not care that you went to Nicaragua and are staying on a tourist visa, or did the exact same thing in Paraguay and are now on something called a short-term residency. Those are completely meaningless to any other country because they don't reflect anything meaningful. And to make it even more extreme, you could argue that, yes, the tourist visa in Nicaragua is a form of temporary residency. It just doesn't have the name officially on the paperwork, and that would be completely valid. So do you then count people who are on that in Nicaragua as being resident in Nicaragua? Well, maybe, but do you count people who just came for the weekend? Again, all these things are kind of slippery slope gray areas. None of them have firm definitions, and that's why no one uses them. Plus, they're not disclosable to the outside world. You can't contact another country, say, hey, is this person listed as resident with you? They don't work that way. To make this even more extreme, though, we could look at that, the Paraguay process, and to a person who's never gone to Paraguay, if you said, are they a resident there? Well, obviously not. They're not there. But if you look at that person who's never been to Nicaragua, you could say, are you a resident there? And you could make the argument that all people in the US and Canada and much of the world are actually temporary residents in Nicaragua who just aren't there because they already have the paperwork, because it's automatic, to be able to stay. That gets into a weird semantic trick, but one that highlights how actually silly it is to try to use residency to mean something outside of the country. It just doesn't make any sense because it's non-uniform. But to take that to a further extreme degree and make it less semantic and make it more factual, if we look at Mexico, Mexico works from a completely different system. Paraguay and Nicaragua require that you go to those countries to become resident. Becoming resident is something you do as an act of being in the country, at least before they issue formal residency. We come up with this weird concept of tourist resident when we don't have formal paperwork, and yes, that's silly, but it highlights important points. But when we're looking at Mexico, something very different happens, and that is that you can, and many people do, acquire their residency prior to going to Mexico. Probably not prior to visiting it, but prior to actually moving to it. So let me break this down. If I'm moving to Paraguay today, I just hop a plane, go to Paraguay. I get to stay for a little while, and I can easily apply very safely and simply for a short-term residency, and I should be able to stay without a problem. That is their process. If I'm coming to Nicaragua, I fly today and go to Nicaragua, hang out for a while, and eventually apply for permanent residency and probably not have a problem. That is their process. If I want to do the same thing to Mexico, there are multiple paths you can take, but the most common, or the one most recommended, is to apply for your residency before you travel to the country. So at some point, many people receive their residency in Mexico when they've not been there. In no way do they physically reside there. In some cases, they've never even visited. So this creates a really weird situation where if someone said, are you resident in Mexico? You could both answer the question, yes, I am a permanent long-term resident in Mexico, while simultaneously being able to say, I've never been in Mexico, never spent a single night there. In English, the one clearly means you're not a resident and in no way are coming close to being a resident. And in the other, it says legally you are and have been a resident of the utmost type, potentially. So this is really extreme, that you would have this scenario where you may be able to claim residency in a country that you've never been to and are not in. So a person who's never left the United States would be like, I'm a Mexican resident. And people could be like, that is a really bizarre situation. What would happen to your taxes if your taxes in the US or Canada or wherever took into consideration when other countries listed you as resident? All kinds of wacky things could start to happen because Mexico could claim you as a resident, but maybe you're also still a resident of Nicaragua. Certainly you could do that. I could do that. I'm a resident of Nicaragua on paper. I can go apply for residency in Mexico right now. I could end up in a scenario where I have Mexican residency and Nicaraguan residency. And if I moved to Paraguay today, I would hold both of those residencies and probably be granted a residency in Paraguay very quickly. I could have 3 international residencies all at the same time. How would a place like the US or Canada deal with that if they were considering it? They can't. It doesn't make any sense. It's hard enough dealing with citizenships, which are very formal and very concrete. The residencies, there's just no way. You would, of course, also have the possibility of countries proactively issuing you a residency. This gets even weirder. So, here in Nicaragua, this doesn't really happen, but it's easy to see how it could, that some countries let you stay for a long time without a formal process. And at some point, they may consider you a resident without notifying you and you not notifying them. I don't know of any country that does this, but you can imagine how easy it would be to create a system where you're allowed to stay based on, the border run system. But after you do it 2 times, they automatically convert you to a temporary resident instead. They don't send you any paperwork. You don't have to apply. It's just an automated system. It's a sovereign country. They can do what they want, right? So they could do that. Any country could do that. And in doing so, that would be very complex to then be like, are you a resident somewhere? You may not even be aware. And then of course, you have the even more complex scenario that countries can issue residency to, like Mexico, is actively. This is a real world scenario. Mexico actually every day issues residency to people who've never been and are not in Mexico in any way whatsoever. That means that any country in the world has the power to issue residency to you today, right? You could have 100 countries suddenly issue residency to every person on Earth and claim the entire planet as their residence. Now, they don't have any power to go out and collect their taxes. They don't have any power to make them come and do anything. They have no power over those people, but they can make the legal claim that all those people are residents there, and it's no less valid than Mexico's claim that you are a resident of Mexico. In one case, you asked for it, and in one case, you didn't, but in both cases, at the end of the day, it is just the government making the claim that a person that they identify under a certain name or whatever is a resident of that country. It's a very bizarre situation, and the only way to think of it logically is to remember that it is a informal situation at an international level that has no meaning outside of an internal discussion inside a country. Now, if you're using the English language, you can say, where do you reside? Where do I reside? I can tell you I reside in Nicaragua. I am physically a resident of Nicaragua. I'm physically a resident of the city of Leon in Nicaragua. Those are things I can say in English, and they are absolutely correct. But to say I am a official resident or a short-term resident or a long-term resident, the technical terms of Nicaragua requires that I have that specific paperwork for that to be accurate. But if a country outside of Nicaragua asks if I'm resident of Nicaragua, then it's a gray area. Do I live there enough that I would consider myself resident when speaking to someone else? Do I want to make that claim? Do I want to claim I'm resident somewhere else? Because technically I have multiple residencies. So which one I want to use depends, much like you use passports based on which one makes the most sense at any given time. There's complications to these systems and these terms. And there's no really good reason for another country to ask you where you are resident, but some do. And so being ready for that can be good, because you don't want to be caught off guard and not know what to say should you ever need to. But understanding that these are soft terms and there is no necessarily concrete answer. Now, if you're an American, you've never left the United States, you're 100% resident in the state you were born in, it's really clear where you are a resident, and there's no gray area and alternative options. But once you start living any degree of time in multiple places or obtaining residency paperwork, then it starts becoming this weird gray area, and it's kind of up to you to interpret it on the spot. But when you're dealing with taxes or other laws in the US, Canada, or other places, and they want to know where you are residing, this refers to where you physically live. It will never refer to which countries have issued you residency paperwork. That is an absolutely meaningless thing. Otherwise, doing things like choosing Paraguay or Nicaragua would often be done based on whether or not they wrote the word resident on the paperwork that they use, which is a really dumb way to handle that. And that's why they don't, right? No one's doing that, but that is why they don't, because the same behavior has different names in different places, and it's not a formal, internationally recognized standard. Yeah, it's complex, and you just kind of have to roll with that, but understanding that it's an internal term only. So here in Nicaragua, when I speak about residency, it means something because I'm talking about my Nicaraguan residency. When I'm in the United States, I talk about my American residency. When I'm other places, I can either say that I'm not a resident or I can speak as to where I do reside. Oh, I am a resident of Nicaragua. So if you move to Nicaragua today, you're just a tourist, but you don't plan on leaving, you go rent your house, and on your first day, you happen to be hanging out in Panama for whatever reason, and someone says, where are you a resident? You say, I'm a resident in Nicaragua, just got there today. And they go, oh, you're a new resident. That's very cool. And it has nothing to do with your paperwork, and saying that you are a resident here is 100% accurate in the English sense, in the conversing with someone on the outside sense. So I hope that that clears it up. This is honestly a little bit difficult to describe, even though it's a very basic thing. It is misused to such an extreme degree that it's actually a little bit hard to kind of break through those myths and barriers and make it crystal clear what it means. And because it's different in every single country, yeah, that highlights things, but it also makes it unclear because every single country is so different than all the others. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at the link, buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. We have a join button if you want to join our community, become part of our ongoing monthly support. It really does help a lot. And hit the like button, share on social media, tell people about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.